Welcome to our second plenary of APALA's 16th Biannual Convention. I'm so excited to kick off today's convention theme of reimagining a new world beyond borders and across oceans with you. My name is Amy Leong Shehart, and I'm the organizer on staff with the APALA Seattle chapter. I want to start off by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from Coast Salish territory, the traditional land of the Duwamish, and want to recognize we are all on borrowed Indigenous land and give honors to those for allowing us to live and work here. We have been living a historical moment that is unforgettable. This pandemic has brought to the forefront the realities of our society and how fractured our systems are, and has led to imaginable consequences and impacts on our communities. With millions of workers unemployed at the height of the pandemic without a social safety net, effects of climate change rapidly increasing, and the continued struggle for racial justice, perhaps this leaves us feeling, what now? What's next? But in this plenary, you will hear from community organizers, advocates, and leaders to discuss their work during this unprecedented time and what their visions are of how we emerge out of this moment stronger than before. To start, I will ask the panelists to introduce themselves and answer the first question. The first question is, this past year, we've witnessed mass movements and disasters. What have you observed that has shifted your perspective or understanding of your community? And what are some lessons that you have learned?
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me for this historic and powerful gathering. Again, my name is Ashley Woodard Henderson. I use she, her pronouns. I'm from the land of the Cherokee, of the Yuki, from Chattanooga, Tennessee, and I'm the first Black woman to serve as co-executive director of the Highlander Research and Education Center. And I think this question is really critically important because I think that as we've made great gains and won many successes, we've also had a year of great intersecting crises that were impacting our communities disproportionately, communities of Black folks, communities of working class people, of other folks of color in urban and rural contexts. And so I think what I'm observing, what is shifting my perspective, what is helping me understand the definition of what a community is and what our practices should be as we continue to learn how to be human together. What are the lessons that I'm learning really are rooted in thinking about how do we center the most directly impacted in ways that are not tokenizing them, in ways that are not putting too much of a burden on them, but that are calling us into discipline and rigor around learning from the folks that have actually weathered these storms before. What does it look like for us to create space to not only value solidarity and write letters of support to one another, but to actually practice it in tangible, everyday, grassroots kinds of ways? What does it look for us to fight for what we deserve, not just what we would concede to as we continue to struggle around things? Like, does this economic system actually work for the people and this planet? When we think about whether or not we should have police and prisons and jails in our communities, when we think about the need for great shifts in what is precious to us, what we need to be able to survive and thrive while also recognizing that this world is finite, the resources on this planet are finite. And so I'm learning what it means to meet the urgency of now, to meet the great expectations and responsibilities that our generation in this 21st century context for freedom and for justice and for liberation for all of our people. What does it mean to meet the urgency of now while also holding the importance of slowing down, actually summing up the lessons of the last year, summing up both what worked, what was useful towards building our movements, and really paying attention to the ways that we failed each other, the things that we need to be accountable for with each other, and how to do that with a great level of grace, because we were also human, surviving one of the hardest experiences that I think any of us ever, like many of us didn't even ever expect to live through, right? These intersecting crises of COVID-19, of an economic crisis, of a crisis in what is happening to folks of color, not only just here in a US context, but across these man-made borders that many of us not only didn't create, but don't believe should exist in the first place. And so I think everything about our perspective should have shifted. How do we create a big we that doesn't call any of us to throw our cultures or identities behind us, that hold us to account to righting the harms that we've created for each other, but that push us beyond sectarianism and siloed work, that actually keeps us from being able to make impossible things possible because of the power of our people working hand in hand together. And so I'm excited about this moment, not because I don't believe that this isn't hard, and not because I'm naive. I have an informed optimism because I'm seeing in this context not folks stepping away from these hard conversations, sometimes these uncomfortable conversations, the expectations for accountability and leaning into one another even when it's hard. I'm seeing folks actually making commitments to deal with grief and hardship and accountability with each other in ways that, again, I think are making impossible things possible, including this very conversation. So I'm excited about being one in the number with you all as we continue to sum up and learn from these lessons.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing, Ashley. Really appreciate your words and your thoughts. I'm now going to pass it off to Tavai.
Hi, my name is Tavai Samwelu. My pronouns are she, her. I have the honor, exhaustion, and privilege of being the executive director of Empowering Pacific Islander Communities, also known as EPIC. EPIC is a national organization that's based on Tongva land in Los Angeles. I'm actually Zooming to you, or not Zooming, I am joining you all virtually right now from what is presently known as Long Beach, where the sacred site of Puvunga is, where many in the Tongva Nation believe is actually a critical part of their creation story, where their nations were first birthed. I've been thinking even more, I don't know, I'm just going to sit with all of that about learning, and also feeling a little bit lost in what Ashley just shared. I think right now has been a beautiful time to be able to learn because of how often I'm called on to be an expert about and in the Pacific Islander community. The notion of having to know and to be certain. And if there's been anything that's been so humbling about the last, year and a half, is just how little I know about myself, about our community, and in particular being called into this moment, um, into this pandemic, into sitting with whether or not we actually built the structures that we needed in order for our communities to survive. Because at the end of the day, that's what was really at hand, at risk. I think the things that have been most challenging and humbling too, as far as lessons, was thinking about how unprepared I was for crisis. How desperately, even in this moment of urgency, we were looking around, figuring out who was going to lead. And the answer, oftentimes, actually, it wasn't me. It wasn't me. I think there's something really critical about sitting in a moment and knowing that during a time of crisis, it wasn't actually my philosophizing or waxing philosophical about justice that our communities needed. That I was trying to get them to fill out the census, and they were asking me how they were going to feed their families, or wanting them to get counted for the next 10 years, and them responding really adamantly, what does 10 years mean if I don't know how I'm going to make it to tomorrow or next month? And so what that pushed for me was thinking more honestly about our work, more critically about this notion of what does what we do and how does it actually lend itself to the survival of our communities. And it's something that I took quite literally during a pandemic, that we actually had to change how we did everything, everything. What I got in deep study around actually was around the Black Panther Party and their survival programs, and thinking about, have I been asking people to join systems that fundamentally were actually not meant to hold them? Or am I now actually shifting things and telling our folks, as they've been telling us for years in one way or another, that white supremacy can't be the upper limit of what we dream for ourselves? But the most healing and restorative and radical ideas I've ever gotten has actually been sitting at the feet of our young people and listening to how audacious they are, how um, they already are pushing things that I had to wait so long to figure out. Um, and then most critically, most importantly is that of any title I hold, the most important one is anti-vi, and how much that actually shapes everything I do for Epic.
Thank you
How
so much for those words, Tava. I really appreciate that. I'm not going to pass it off to Hideki.
Hello, my name is Hideki Yoshikawa. I'm an Okinawan and anthropologist and teaching at the universities in Okinawa. And I'm also the director of the Okinawa Environmental Justice Project. And I'm also the international director of Save the Dugong Campaign Center. Thank you for the question. In Okinawa, just like many other parts of the world, we've been suffering from this COVID spread of the COVID-19. And unfortunately, in Japan, Okinawa is one of the worst situations. We still have many people suffering from the COVID. So in these situations, we found ourselves very much constrained, and because of these situations, the kind of the regular works and regular activities that has been very much limited. That include our protest movements, our sitting movements against the construction of the base at Henoko-Ora Bay. That's been our very long time struggle. So in that, not only our daily lives, but also our important protest movement has been limited due to the COVID. So, but at the same time, we were able to, many people start picking up the tools of internet, just like the webinars, so we're trying to reach out to other people through this internet and SNS, and that's what we've been doing. So in that aspect, I think we are sort of improving the way we can protest, we can engage in our social movement.
Thank you for your perspective, Hideki. Really appreciate the international views and visions. I will now pass it off to Jessica.
Hi, I'm Jessica Tang, and I am currently a middle school social studies history teacher serving as the president of the Boston Teachers Union. I'm also a founding member of the APALA Massachusetts chapter and sit on the National APALA Executive Board as the AFT, American Federation of Teachers appointee. I also serve on a number of other nonprofit, community, and labor boards, but those are three of my most significant and relevant roles for the APALA Convention. I think that we've definitely learned a lot from this past year in terms of both how communities and government and various bodies have responded to the disasters, as well as how communities have mobilized to address the tragedies and the racial injustice, amongst other issues that have happened over this last year during the pandemic. So I think one powerful piece is definitely the increased visibility of the AAPI community and not just the issues and what we're facing, because I think we all know, as others have shared, that these issues have long been a part of the Asian American and Pacific Islander experiences in America for a very, very long time. So, what we've seen though is increasingly more people speaking up, speaking out, sharing their experiences, and demanding to be visible and coming together to organize to figure out how do we correct this injustice and how do we work also, I think, intersectionally and intentionally intraracially to confront all the different injustices that are being felt and reckoned with, whether that be racial injustice, whether that be injustices that are happening in housing, healthcare, and other places. And so the hope, I think, are there are lessons learned about the divisions of the past and why they exist, but also figuring out how do we move forward intentionally to create a greater and larger movement that is both inclusive and responsive. And it's not a either or a what about, but also and. So I think those are some of the big lessons that have come out, that there are fissures and we need to address them and tackle them head on. And there are definitely a lot of areas for growth within the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, as we, even within the AAPI community, have greater solidarity and understanding of experiences and how all of these different racial injustices and other injustices impact us.
Wow, thank you all so much for introducing yourselves and sharing, the lessons that you've learned in this moment. I think it's super important we continue to have these conversations of all the lessons learned, to be able to build off of that. I'm going to move on to the second question. Can you please discuss your vision on how we emerge out of this moment and how we should be working together? Are there ways people are organizing around these issues that inspire you towards a new world? What does that new world look like? And I will ask Ashley to answer that question first.
I don't know that actually for me, rushing through this moment to what's next is the most strategic thing. Because I don't even know. I think to Tavai's point, like I don't know that we know what all the answers to the questions are yet, or even asking ourselves the question about what we're supposed to be learning from a moment that isn't over yet, right? I think that's a really, really, really important piece, right? COVID is not yet over, right? It's not over. People are still dying. Our people still don't have access to the vaccination, or aren't getting it for all sorts of numbers of reasons. They're both systemic and historic, responses to state interventions around our health or lack thereof, right? Our communities have still been wholesale abandoned by the very elected officials that are supposed to be passing and enforcing policies that change our material conditions from bad to good. And so I hesitate to feel a level of urgency to talk about the next moment when I think we're still in a moment and still summing up the lessons, still understanding what the remaining questions are from a moment that is still ongoing, right? I think this piece that Tavai raised around preparedness for crisis is really, really a question that is critical for us to engage, right? I think that I'm sitting with a lot of lessons about what it means to have gotten so good at mobilizing our people around our grief, around mobilizing our people to fight like hell for the dead, but not really know how to protect the living. I feel like I'm sitting with what it means that disaster capitalism and necro capitalism, where rich people get to decide who lives and dies based on the amount of money that they have access to, is so where we are right now. And what it means that even in our do-gooder work, that there are philanthropic institutions who are creating write-offs for very rich people who are giving money to charity for the sake of being able to say that they responded to a rapid response moment, when there is nothing rapid about the moment that we're in, right? The moment that we're in is a part of a long arc of neglect of our people, of white supremacy, of economic extraction, of cultural appropriation, right? All of this stuff is centuries in the making. And the only thing that is rapid or urgent is the need to dismantle these systems and to do it in a way where we all end up at the finish line together, right? So I think to the point, I think our experiences have been parallel and disproportionate, right? They're not the same experiences, and solidarity doesn't require it to be. But I think in this moment where we're envisioning the potentiality of emerging out of one moment and into the next long arc of what our contributions to this community, our communities and to this world will be, and how we should be working together is really centered around, to me, a methodology that I'm learning, or a concept that I'm learning from one of the great coaches of social movements, Norma Wong, who has taught me about the concept of all under heaven intact, right? How do we navigate tearing down this world that is never giving these systems that we've inherited that do not work and were not designed to work in our best interest? How do we dismantle them, as my grandmother would say, uproot them so they can't grow back again, while also living into our values in practice, not just talking about them, to Devi's point, but like living them, practicing it, thinking about being in communities of practice with one another, where perfection isn't required, but accountability is, right? And how do we do that while holding grace for the humanity of our people? Even, especially for those in leadership, for those of us who have been called by our community. I don't believe that individuals can self-appoint themselves to leadership, not in our movement, that our communities actually identify who their leaders should be. And in this moment where they're, like Tavai said, there's such an expectation that everybody know everything about all the things, right? For us to be in great practice of solidarity, we have to know everybody's issues. We have to be experts on those issues. We have to talk on our social media and to our communities about every single issue, when actually the honest answer is that we are building this plane while flying it at 40,000 feet while being shot at from the inside and the outside, right? So how do we practice accountability that is not punitive, but is full of grace, that invites us to be in our fullest dignity with one another, while also learning that actually where we are weak and don't have knowledge, where our infrastructure is not ready, is an opportunity for us to get closer and closer to wholeness. And that if we actually do that work together, that we actually will be stronger than we were before we started, right? So my hope is that we will continue to lean into each other, not giving people a get out of accountability free card by offering grace, but by recognizing that there's both a responsibility in this moment for us to be disciplined and rigorous and creating the infrastructure that will get us. To me, when I think about like abolition, Andrea Ritchie often says that abolition is getting us 1,000 miles ahead of the harm in the first place, right? And what would our movements be doing? What would our community organizations be creating? What would we be making possible if we were thinking about being 1,000 miles ahead of the need to be prepared for a crisis, right? What would happen if we didn't just get really, really excellent at flexing the muscles of response, of rapid response, of mobilization and response to the murder of our people, response to the failures of the state and even the successful ways that the state intentionally abandons our communities? What would happen if we had the resources ahead of time? What would happen if we had the relationships ahead of time? And I mean, can I just be honest? If what I'm talking about, those relationships, I mean, both as a Black person that does solidarity work with all sorts of people from all sorts of places, what does it look like for those organizations that we are expressing solidarity with to challenge anti-Blackness in their spaces? But also, what does it look, and for Black people to challenge anti-Blackness too, right? And what does it look like for particularly Black-led movements to also, be in intentional conversations about any other prejudices and biases that we might also have as communities? How do we make sure that those relationships exist before the crisis? How do we get 1,000 miles ahead of the harm? Because I think that as we're looking towards this new world, the thing that is inspiring me in this moment about what it looks like to practice getting to that world is recognizing, one, what I said earlier about that knowing where the Bothan is. There is an urgency to this moment, and this is a blip on the radar of the history of what got us here, and a blip on the radar of the next long arc that we are actually the authors of the next story, right? What does it look like for us to step up into our rightful place to say that we are the people that get to define what's next, and that is not a reality where people don't thrive, where they only win what we concede to and not what we deserve, right? What does it look like? How does it feel in practice to demand and build what we actually deserve? That is what inspires me about the building of the new world. What's the story that we're telling about what it will be like after this? And what would then be required of us to walk that forward, right? What would we have to do? We'd have to radically reimagine our ways of being in relationship with each other. We'd have to radically remember, right, what it means that capitalism has dismembered us from our homelands, from some of our cultural ways of being with each other, from our languages, from our food ways, right, from our national ways of resolving conflict without harm. What would we have to radically reimagine, and what would we have to literally remember to be able to practice building it, governing it, sustaining it, living into it, while we also simultaneously tear the things down that are keeping us from it, right? And recognizing that in that, each of us has a particular role. We might not all do the same thing to get to that liberation land, right? We might all have different roles to play in that journey to freedom. And so how do we do that in right relationship where everybody can know their role and can play their role excellently for the benefit of our people? When I see us leaning into that as a practice, I feel inspired for the next world, what is coming after this. I think we are literally figuring out ways to practice this in our communities and with each other in our movement spaces, and are figuring out what it means to scale it in a way that everybody gets to thrive. Everybody has what they need. And our abolitionist future is one where everybody has what they need, so no harm needs to happen in the first place.
Thank you so much for those words, Ashley. I really appreciate you for regrounding us and recognizing we're still living in this moment, and how we need to pace ourselves, how we prepare ourselves to strategically engage with each other. I will now pass it off to Hideki.
Before, since we are still in a sort of dire situations right now in this the COVID situations, and at the same time that our government, Japanese governments, is just pushing forward with the construction of a military base in Henoko Bay. It's really hard to have clear vision, of what we can achieve out of this situation. So that's really a very painful reality. But at the same time, I think we have managed to do a lot of things as well. For example, last year, we had APALA. I asked APALA members to submit public comments to the Okinawa prefectural government. I thought that was kind of strange idea myself, but I thought anyway, I asked. So I asked APALA members to submit public comments regarding the construction of the base, the Henoko Bay. And APALA some of the APALA members actually wrote the public comments from across the ocean and submitted to the Okinawa prefectural government. And the public comments were supposed to be written in Japanese, so the members, APALA members, used the Google translation to translate into Japanese and submit the comments. That was very inspirational for us, those Okinawans. We realized, even with we are in this very difficult situations, and we knew that the APALA members themselves and the U.S. itself was suffering from this COVID-19. It's really worse situation, but they still found the time and to send the public comments. So that was very inspirational. That at least gave me the idea that even in this very difficult time, we can still find or manage to find ways to support other people. So yeah, that was inspirational and really taught me how we can envision the world, you know, a world that's where we can really help each other, support each other in very innovative ways.
Thank you so much, Hideki, for sharing. Really appreciate that. I will now pass it off to Jessica.
Well, I've shared this a little bit in my previous comments, and certainly share a lot of the sentiments of others on this panel. And I think the one piece that I do really think a lot about is that piece of intersectional and interracial solidarity, and thinking about how we do that, both while acknowledging the tensions that exist within our communities, but also the opportunities there. And what's really, I think become more and more apparent to me is just the lack of understanding of each other's histories. And so that's why we've fought really hard at the Boston Teachers Union through the work of the BTU Ethnic Studies Now Committee for ethnic studies in our schools. And I do think that that is a missing piece of our curriculum, is not just culturally relevant pedagogy as an educator, and that's my perspective coming from the Boston Teachers Union and AFT, but rethinking how do we decolonize the curriculum? How do we also ensure that what we're teaching is culturally relevant? And how do we also be much more intentional about making sure that ethnic studies, African American studies, Asian American studies, and Latinx studies, et cetera, are all a part of the curriculum, and it's not an add-on, but actually a part of our quote unquote mainstream education. And I think that will actually help to lay a much better foundation for how we as organizers and labor and community can be much more intentional about, again, not, just glossing over the past and the tensions that existed, but also analyzing them and understanding, how different groups have been pit against each other, and how we can't be complicit in that. We can't let Asian Americans, for example, be weaponized, whether it's in terms of greater access for Black and Latinx community members, like I've seen in a lot of exam schools admissions issues across the country. And that does come with education and having other communities understanding, well, why is it that a lot of the Asian American community is culturally, I think, familiar with exam schools and maybe extra resistant to those changes, and building that understanding and that cultural history and historic history without being weaponized and without being pit against each other, I think is incredibly important as we continue on in the future in true solidarity work.
Absolutely, Jessica. I think your points are very valid in how we continue to work with each other during this moment. I will now ask Tabai to answer this question.
I was especially excited to hear Ashley reference Norma Wong, who, I hope everybody gets the chance to be in community and relationship with Norma Wong. And to know, for me, Norma Wong is Pacific Islander as fuck. So much of what she says is ancestral Native Hawaiian or Kanaka wisdom, drawn very deeply from that ancestral wisdom, and how close she is to that remembering, right? And oftentimes feels like was never forgotten. I think there's also a piece of what she reminds me of is what it means to not be far removed from your indigeneity, to understand the ways that some of that, how much of that liberation, like, you have at a molecular level. I think there's often talk about epigenetics and the notion of trauma being in people's DNA, and all of these things are true to some extent. And there are elders who remind us the way that liberation also lives in our DNA, how much our bodies remember freedom even when we can't, even when we're trying to intellectualize something else. Um, the other piece, right, as you know, we talk about New World or whatever the case. You know, this is probably why Miriam Kava says that hope is a discipline. Why we have to practice it in these moments and all the time, because it can feel so far away. But in particular, I love, and I think this is something I've heard from Norma Wong and other organizers, and especially, you know, I was attending a talk with Dr. Jamaica Osorio. He said, when I'm thinking about the next world or the new world, I'm following queer and trans people of color. Like, those are the folks who've always had to create a different world because of just how oppressive and hostile our environments have been, post-colonization and under capitalism and other, right? There are folks who have been creating over and over in different iterations those worlds. And that's actually why our movements have to center queer and trans and Black and Indigenous communities, because they've been making different things. And oftentimes, unfortunately, while some of us have been lending our talents to reinforcing shit that fucked them up, that actually threatened their survival. And so I think this other piece that I'm really clear about is I'm not getting to any new world unless I'm committed to, at every moment, betraying capitalism and white supremacy. I love that the Nat Ministry talks about rest being the place where the new world lives. The Nat Ministry had posted something about, like, my deepest dreams are to be useless to capitalism. I can't wait. I can't wait. The other piece that I think about this notion of new world, and especially had to think critically about as a young woman of color leading a national organization, was I was also very clear in a community, right? Like, Pacific Islanders, 70% identify as independent conservative. I had to think about how I was going to deploy messages that would be seen as radical and therefore foreign, or be read as not PI enough. And so, rather than talk to them about revolution, I talked to them about memory. I talked about decolonization, well, really like pre-colonization. I said, remember that we've always been about equity, that before anybody came and stole our land, we divided things based on need. That actually, you know, in Hawaii, what I was taught is the ahupua'a, or the watershed, divided the land and dictated where resources came from, and that they were distributed based on need. That when folks are talking about gender inclusion, you know, in Maori tradition, there's 16 genders, right? That we've always had third and fourth and fifth and six genders, because every way we talk about each other is about being in relation, about being in good balance and good relationship to each other, to the land, and especially thinking about this notion of te o leva, right? In Samoan, was how do you take care of the space that connects us? And that not only does it connect us in good and bad times, so that it continues to bear fruit. And so I'm not taking care of the space only when I need to, only when I think it's convenient, that I'm taking care of the space all the time, because people are not disposable. I think the other piece that we come around to is especially thinking about our matriarchies, right? That, you know, misogyny never ceases to amaze me, all the places that it can be so insidious and show up. But to sit with people and remind them that we come from matriarchy. So we've always trusted women to tell us how and where to go. as the culture keepers and bearers of our communities. And so this is the piece, right? Like for some of our folks, I'm gonna pause. My niece just drove by in her little Jeep. My niece has a car, I don't, it's fine. Yeah, so picking up on the point of matriarchies and always trusting women, but this other piece too, why I talk about memory is because some of us don't have to create new worlds. Some of us need to return to land, return to each other, return to ourselves. And how beautiful and brilliant that is. And I think the other piece that I want to lift up in this imagining too is what I'm also sitting with is how much courage and bravery that everything always demands, because the other part is how scary it is when you have to be the first, when you have to go to the place that nobody's been. And especially in hearing Ashley say, like, the first Black woman to lead the Highlander Center. The thing about being the first is it can not only be lonely, but it means that you are inherently going to a space that has never seen you before, was not prepared for people like you, and especially not prepared for the communities that you choose to serve. And so you got to go and make things and set things up. And it means oftentimes going alone and pushing folks to go. And also sitting with our young people and other folks and talking about the ways that injustice makes what we're supposed to do, what's right, what's balanced, incredibly inconvenient and very expensive and wildly unpalatable, right? So as Ashley was talking about funders and philanthropy, folks who've come to me and asked, how can we be anti-racist? How can we be equitable? And the question I always return with, are you ready to break yourself? Are you ready to not exist? And that's the part that I'm actually preparing myself for. That's what I'm preparing Epic for. Like, in this new world, in this more just, iteration of what needs to happen, I'm prepared for us to not exist. We might not be the answer. And that requires a lot of humility. It demands a lot of courage to say out loud, I might not be the answer. This thing that we dreamed and schemed 10 years ago may not be the thing anymore. So what are we getting ready for next? And who am I making space for? The next dreamer, the next more audacious leader who's continuously pushing me to be bolder, to be more daring in what we decide to pursue.
So I think the sentence you said, that liberation lives in our DNA, is super important to recognize again, because that's why we are all here, is that we feel it in our hearts and we feel it in the moments that we take and the movements we take on, is that we are part of this and it is in our DNA. So thank you so much for acknowledging that. Thank you, panelists, for sharing your thoughts and your visions of how we emerge out of this moment stronger than before. I think it's important to acknowledge we are still living this moment, and that what we do and how we take on this mission to dismantle the systems that have placed barriers on our communities is acknowledged, and figure out how we can work together in community. Relationships have existed before the crisis, and we hope to continue to build them. So with that being said, to close today's panel, I'm going to ask each panelist to share a short closing remark. With hundreds of APALA members and allies tuned into the convention, what is your call to action for convention attendees? I'm going to pass it off to Hideki.
First of all, again, I want to express my sincere appreciations to the APALA members for that APALA has taken concrete actions, and the APALA's actions regarding this Okinawan's issues really inspired myself and many other people in Okinawa. And I also want to emphasize that I myself and many other Okinawans are admired Okinawans admire, and of learning from the way APALA organizes itself and prepare its members, and how the APALA trains next generations of young people. You have this wonderful, these principles for collective liberations. They really serve as your guiding principles, but they also help us to envision how we can organize the Okinawa's movement. And you also have this many toolkits, labor toolkits on anti-Asian racism, or resource guides on anti-Asian violence. These are very, very useful, and this articulation of these principles and availability of these toolkits are very critical, not only, I'm sure, not only to your APALA's activities, but also for us, for people across the ocean, beyond the borders, to learn from it, to incorporate into our social movements. So for that, I truly appreciate our relationship with APALA members. Thank you.
Thank you, Hideki, for sharing your perspective and the update from your community and what you are continuing to do to ensure your folks and your community comes out stronger than before. I will now pass it off to Jessica. Jessica, you want to share what your call of action is?
I think my call to action would be to really figure out what is it that you as an individual can do. And I think there are so many ways to advance the work, not just of APALA, but of greater social, racial, and economic justice, which again is part of the mission of APALA as well. And so that can take on so many forms. And I think sometimes we feel like we have to do something really, really big immediately, but sometimes it takes time to build towards that. So it could start with just creating an AAPI caucus within your union. It could be joining efforts for advocating for ethnic studies and building solidarity across unions. It could be figuring out, well, how do we work within our community to, again, educate, inform, help everyone, particularly in our community, have a better analysis of race and economics and capitalism and climate change, all these other issues, and how we need to be a part of the change and addressing these issues moving forward. And that also means having hard conversations within our community as well, and acknowledging, that when we say API, oftentimes we're leaving out the PI, and thinking about the impacts of colonization as well, and also, beyond the API community, again, thinking really about how am I being an ally? How am I actually being even more than an ally and an advocate for not just our causes, but other causes, and seeing how we're interconnected. And that does take time and energy and effort to really understand and build that racial analysis, not just for us as individuals, but for our larger community as well. And so that's what I would hope that people come out of this convention realizing, not just the importance of APIs in the labor movement, but of API activism as we continue to confront not just issues that directly impact us, but how those issues really are interconnected into this larger historical context, and that understanding each other's areas where we have to be working together and not let ourselves be divided is just so important.
Thank you for sharing, Jessica. Really appreciate you being here and sharing your perspective. And, we are excited to see how we as APALA can support you and your community and the teachers as you move forward towards the new school year. Now I would call Tavai to come share her closing remarks and her call of action.
Yeah, so this is a calling in from myself and everybody who may be joining us. This is my call to inaction. This is my call to rest, to slow down, to stop, to listen, to care. I say this especially and specifically in this space as my experiences of labor and labor movements are just how frequently our folks will overwork, just how frequently our folks that the first thing you set aside is your own humanity in order to be in this. I need your rest and I need your humanity. I can't connect without it. So yeah, this is my call to inaction. I hope you all rest. I hope you all sleep. I hope you do it so I can do it too. I'm saying it to you now on this recording so that later, when I'm not resting, when I'm ignoring my body, when I am doing anything other than getting free, that one of you are welcome. One of you or many of you are welcome to play this back to me and remind me of how past Tavai said that she was going to rest, so that she was going to care, and so that she was going to do it with you.
Thank you, Tavai, for sharing. Really appreciate your thoughts and, sharing how you have been showing up for your community and what your call of action is making us realize, we need to check ourselves at the same time. So thank you for that. Now I will call Ashley to share her call of action to our community.
Awesome. I feel excited about the opportunity to invite us all to recommit, to make an embodied commitment to, again, acknowledging our positionality in this moment, this sacred moment, to be able to show up excellently in service of our people by being willing to ask the questions and take the pauses to really interrogate what are we supposed to be learning right now and how does that influence our thinking about what's next. I feel excited to be one in the number with you as an informed optimist that is, again, learning, as Miriam said, to really practice hope as a discipline. To be able to tell the story about what's next, and then again to be intentional about what then are we responsible for to see that world come to fruition for us and for future generations, right? I do this work not just because I want to see a world in the future that is better than the one that I inherited. I also do it because I personally want to experience it. And so I feel like the call to action is actually really just to say, welcome to the movement. Let's make a recommitment to being embodied of the values that we say that we hold. And I think I'd be remiss not to offer that, the Movement for Black Lives, the Rising Majority, Highlander Center, all of these incredible organizations, the People's Collective for Liberation and Justice. So many organizations are out here doing this work. And that's just the folks that are doing it together. That doesn't even mention all of the hundreds of organizations, thousands of organizations that make each of those coalitions so strong. So I guess my invitation is to say, recommit, embody that commitment, and to be down with the folks that are actually out here doing this work every day on the ground, doing the scary sacrifices, but also being transformed in the service of the work in ways that make us all individually better humans, and for being better humans together, moving us towards saving a world, right? That's actually what we have the potential to do in this moment. Now is a moment not just to go back to some old form of normalcy that was never good for us. Now is also not a time to be comfortable and not put on more pressure to the systems that be for the sake of the systems that ought to become. Now is a time to fight even more, not only to grieve all of those that we've lost over the last year, the last decade, the last several hundred years. Now is an opportunity for us to both hold ourselves accountable to building a world where those losses never happen again in this way. But it's also an important opportunity for us to fight like hell for the living. And so I hope that you join all of us people of goodwill, to demand what we deserve and to not settle for anything less. This is our moment, y'all. This is the moment for us to really do what we were born to put on this planet to do. I believe that is a sacred work. and a sacred responsibility. And I don't want to be alone in this work, and I'm sure you don't either, and we don't have to be. So I ask for you to believe, like me, that none of us are free until all of us are free, to dedicate your life to that movement building, and to move towards actually being able to win and sustain those wins. That's the work of this moment. And again, I'm really, really grateful for this family, for this community, to Divide, for her brilliance, and just really grateful to have been one of the number with y'all tonight.
Thank you, Ashley, for being here and sharing your perspective and giving us a real strong call of action that we can take on. I want to say again, thank you to all the panelists for being here today and sharing their visions and their thoughts and what the call of action is for our community. I look forward to standing in solidarity with you as we continue to fight and build a stronger movement than before.